Since I was 12 years old, an envelope arrived at my family's house every 5 years, always in March, always with no return address, always containing a small amount of cash and a single handwritten line that never once signed a name. My family called it the mystery money. By the third envelope, we'd mostly stopped speculating about it out loud, the way you stop asking about any strange, harmless thing that simply becomes part of the furniture of your life. I assumed for 2 decades that it was some distant relative of my father's, or an old family friend with an eccentric habit, or possibly a mistake that had simply never corrected itself. I never once imagined it was the opening move of the strangest inheritance a person can receive. I should tell you what the envelopes actually said, because the lines themselves are the whole key to this story, even though it took me 20 years and a stranger's death to understand that. The first one came a few weeks after my 12th birthday. Inside was $200 in cash, and a small card that read, in careful, old-fashioned handwriting, for the boy who gave back the wallet. I remember my mother turning that card over and over, looking for anything else on it, and finding nothing. No postmark she could make sense of, no return address. Just a plain envelope that had somehow found its way to a house in a town of 11,000 people without anyone in it ever having heard the sender's name. I had, in fact, given back a wallet that year, a fat one, stuffed with cash, that I'd found on the bleachers at a Little League game and turned into the concession stand without a second thought, because it had never once occurred to 12-year-old me that keeping it was an option worth considering. I hadn't told anyone outside my own family. I certainly hadn't told a stranger. My father, I remember, spent almost a full week trying to figure out if someone at the concession stand had somehow tracked us down to say thank you in an unusually elaborate way, and eventually gave up, filing it under the category of things small towns occasionally produce, and nobody ever fully explains. The second envelope came when I was 17, $300 this time, and a line that read, for the boy who stayed. I genuinely did not know, at 17, what that one meant, and neither did my parents. And I remember lying awake that night running through a mental list of every recent decision I'd made, unable to land on anything that felt significant enough to deserve a stranger's attention. It would be 15 years before I found out exactly which night it was referring to. The third came at 22, just after I'd graduated college into a recession with no job prospects and a mountain of quiet panic I hadn't told my parents about. $500, and a line that read, for the man who told the truth when it cost him something. That one, at least, I could connect to something specific, a summer internship where I'd flag an accounting discrepancy that got a well-liked coworker fired, at real cost to my own standing in that office, because covering for it had felt, in the moment, like something I simply couldn't do. I remember sitting with that envelope for a long time, feeling genuinely unsettled for the first time rather than charmed. That internship had ended badly for me socially. People in that office had quietly sided with the coworker, assumed I'd been looking to make myself look good at his expense, and I'd left that summer job with no reference and a bruised sense of what honesty was actually worth in a room full of adults. To have a stranger somehow know about it and reward it felt less like a gift and more like being watched through a window I hadn't known existed. By the fourth envelope, at 27, I'd started to feel less charmed by the mystery and more unsettled by it. Someone, somewhere, was not just sending me money. They were watching my life closely enough to know things about it that I had never spoken aloud to anyone outside a very small circle. I tried, that year, to actually investigate. Postmarks from 3 different cities over the 20 years. No consistent pattern. A P.O. box that had been closed for over a decade by the time I thought to check it. I gave up after a few weeks, the way you give up on a puzzle with no visible edges. The fifth envelope should have arrived when I was 32. It didn't. Instead, on a Tuesday in April, I got a phone call from a law office in a city 3 states away, from an attorney named Ms. Patterson, asking if she could speak with me about the estate of a man named Arthur Lowell. I told her, honestly, that I had never heard the name in my life. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that has stayed with me exactly as it was spoken. That doesn't surprise me. Mr. Lowell was very particular about that. I need to ask you to come to my office in person, because what I have to explain to you is going to take longer than a phone call, and I think you're going to want to be sitting down for parts of it. I drove 3 states over on a Thursday, in the rain, with absolutely no idea what I was walking into, running through every dark possibility a person's mind manufactures on a long drive alone. That it was some kind of scam, that I was about to be told I owed money rather than receiving it, that my parents had somehow kept a family secret from me for 32 years. None of it came close to the actual shape of what Ms. Patterson had waiting for me. Her office was smaller and quieter than I'd pictured, tucked above a bakery in a town I'd never had a reason to visit before that day. And she greeted me with the careful, measured warmth of someone who has clearly delivered strange news to bewildered strangers before and has learned exactly how much to soften it and how much to simply let land. She had a thick folder waiting on the desk between us before I'd even finished sitting down. "I want to say, before I explain any of this," she told me, "that you are not in any trouble, and this is not a scam, and I understand if some part of you needs to hear both of those things twice." I did. She said them again. What Ms. Patterson told me, over the next 2 hours, rearranged 20 years of my life into a shape I hadn't known it had. Arthur Lowell had died 6 weeks earlier, at 81, alone, with no living spouse, no children, and, as far as any of his lawyers had ever been able to determine, no family at all. He had built, over 5 decades, a modest but genuinely substantial fortune through a chain of hardware and building supply stores across the Midwest, sold most of it off in his 60s, and spent the last 2 decades of his life almost entirely out of public view, in a house Ms. Patterson described, without much exaggeration, as comfortable but strange. A man who had the means to live anywhere and chose, instead, to live quietly and watch the world from a careful distance. His will, Ms. Patterson explained, named me as sole heir to his entire remaining estate. Not a portion, all of it. And then she told me the condition attached to it, which was the part that took the longest to explain because it wasn't really a legal condition at all. It was an explanation of a project Arthur Lowell had apparently been running, quietly and precisely, for over 3 decades, of which I was only one small part. Arthur Lowell, it turned out, had been badly burned once, early in his career, by a business partner, a man Arthur had trusted completely, who had presented every outward sign of decency and generosity, who'd stood up at Arthur's own wedding and given a toast about loyalty that Arthur, according to his journals, could still recite from memory 40 years later. When a real test came, a supplier dispute where the partner had quietly falsified inventory records to cover a personal debt, letting the blame and the financial consequence fall entirely on Arthur. The man had lied, cheated Arthur out of a significant portion of his early business, and left him to rebuild almost from scratch in his 30s, with a damaged reputation in an industry small enough that word traveled fast and stuck for years. Ms. Patterson said Arthur talked about it in the private journals his estate had inherited along with everything else, as the single event that reshaped how he saw people for the rest of his life. He became convinced, she said, that the version of a person you meet at a dinner table, warm, generous, well-spoken, tells you almost nothing true about what they'll do the one time it actually cost them something to do the right thing. And he became obsessed, in the specific, patient way only a very wealthy and very solitary man can afford to become obsessed with something, in finding out whether real, unrewarded decency, the kind nobody's watching for, the kind that costs the person something and gets nothing back, was actually as rare as his one bad partner had made it feel. So he built a project around finding out, working through a small, discreet network of private observers and researchers over the decades. People paid generously and bound by strict confidentiality, whose full extent Ms. Patterson herself said she'd only partially been able to reconstruct from his records. Arthur Lowell identified moments where ordinary people, mostly young, mostly with nothing to gain and no one watching, made a small, real choice about their own decency. A found wallet returned intact. A friend defended at real social cost. A truth told when a lie would have been easier and safer. He didn't reward it immediately. He waited, and he watched at a careful legal and personal distance to see whether that first moment was a fluke or a pattern, whether the same person, given a second and third and fourth quiet test over the following decades, would keep choosing the harder, more honest thing when nobody was checking. Ms. Patterson told me, one of 11 people Arthur Lowell had been observing this way over the years. I was the only one, out of the 11, who had passed every single observed test across 2 full decades. I want to be honest about how strange that sentence felt to hear out loud, because "passed every test" implies I knew I was being tested, and I hadn't the faintest idea. Ms. Patterson, seeing my face, explained the rest of it gently. The wallet at 12 had been the first flag. Arthur's observers noted it, quietly, the way they apparently noted dozens of similar small moments involving dozens of different people every year, filing most of them away and never following up. What made me different, what actually got me on Arthur's much smaller, closely watched list, was the second envelope's line, "The boy who stayed." At 17, without ever knowing anyone was watching, I had stayed behind after a house party to help clean up and cover for a friend named Toby who'd broken an expensive glass cabinet door that wasn't his to break at a house belonging to a classmate's parents who were, by all accounts, not people you wanted to disappoint. Toby's home life that year was falling apart in ways I only partly understood at 17. A father drinking heavily, a mother who'd already left once and come back once. And something in me, standing in that kitchen at midnight with a dustpan in my hand, had simply decided that whatever consequence was coming belonged on my shoulders instead of his, for a night, on top of everything else he was already carrying. I let several other friends assume, for a while, that I'd been the one responsible for it. I had never corrected the record, because Toby was going through something at home I understood, even at 17, mattered more than my own reputation among a handful of other teenagers. I'd genuinely forgotten most of the details of that night, until Ms. Patterson read Arthur's file notes on it back to me. And hearing it in a stranger's careful legal summary was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Someone describing a small, forgotten decision of mine back to me, as though it had been the hinge of something enormous. From there, Arthur's observers had checked in, quietly and at a distance, roughly once every 5 years, sometimes constructing genuine small circumstances to see how I'd respond. Ms. Patterson admitted, with visible discomfort, that at least 2 of the coincidences I remembered from my 20s, including the accounting discrepancy at 22, had actually been engineered scenarios. Situations his network had specifically arranged to see what I'd do. Not organic tests I'd simply happened to encounter on my own. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of things, a little violated, honestly, to learn that a private, difficult choice I'd made at 22 had been manufactured by a stranger as an experiment. And also, underneath that, something closer to being moved because whatever Arthur Lowell's methods, the actual choices had still been mine. Nobody had made me tell the truth about that discrepancy. They'd only made sure I had the opportunity to. I asked Ms. Patterson the question I most needed answered. What had happened to the other 10? She hesitated before answering, glancing down at the folder as though weighing how much of it was actually hers to share, then seemed to decide that I'd earned the fuller picture. She was careful and professional about it, but she told me enough. Most of the 10 had simply drifted out of the observation over the years, decent but remarkable people whose small moments of choice were ordinary, mixed, human, sometimes kind, sometimes not, the way most of us actually are, which never disqualified anyone from anything. Because Arthur wasn't looking for saints, he was looking for consistency. A woman in Ohio, Ms. Patterson mentioned, had received envelopes for nearly 15 years before Arthur's notes simply concluded, without judgment, that her life had become stable and happy enough that the small, unglamorous tests stopped presenting themselves in any meaningful way, and the observation had quietly wound down rather than failed. 2 others, a set of brothers from the same small town, had been dropped from the project in their 20s for reasons Ms. Patterson genuinely didn't have full records of, lost to whatever gaps existed in a project run, ultimately, by one increasingly elderly and increasingly private man. 3 of the 11, though, had failed in the specific way that mattered to him. Real moments, later in life, where the easier and more self-serving choice had won out clearly and repeatedly, in ways his observers documented in careful, dispassionate detail. One had let a co-worker take the blame for his own mistake. In a scene Ms. Patterson described that sounded, uncomfortably, almost identical in shape to something I'd read about only weeks earlier in an entirely different context, a reminder that this particular failure of character is common enough to happen in more than one story at once. One had quietly kept money that wasn't his when an accounting error handed it to him. Twice, years apart. The second time, even after receiving an envelope that Ms. Patterson said Arthur's notes described as a final, generous benefit of the doubt. One, Ms. Patterson said, with the driest understatement I've ever heard from a lawyer, made a series of choices remarkably similar to the ones made by Mr. Lowell's original business partner. Those three had simply stopped receiving envelopes, without explanation, and had likely never known they'd been part of anything at all, never mind that they'd failed it. I asked if any of them had ever tried to figure out where their own mystery money had gone. Ms. Patterson said, as far as her record showed, not one of them ever had. They'd simply moved on, the way you move on from anything strange and unexplained that quietly stops. I was the only one left standing at 20 years, and Arthur Lowell, apparently, had intended to keep the observation running for at least a decade more before making any decision about an heir. He hadn't planned to die at 81 of a sudden cardiac event on an ordinary Tuesday. Ms. Patterson told me his final will, updated only 8 months before his death, had named me outright, with a note attached that she read to me directly from the file, in his own words, because she said she thought I deserved to hear it exactly as he'd written it rather than summarized. It said, I have spent 30 years looking for proof that a person can be quietly, consistently good with nothing to gain from it. I found it in a boy who returned a wallet at 12 and never once, in 20 years of my watching, stopped being that same boy when it cost him something. I don't know him. I never let myself meet him, because I didn't want my presence to become the reason he made a single one of these choices. But I know him better, I think, than most people who call each other family. Everything I have is his. I have thought about that word, family, more than almost anything else in this entire story. Arthur Lowell had no children, no spouse, no siblings he'd spoken to in decades. And somewhere in the strange, solitary architecture of his life, a stranger he deliberately never met had become the closest thing he had to it. I did eventually learn where the original wound came from, not from Ms. Patterson, but from a box of Arthur's personal journals his estate released to me along with everything else, months later, once I'd had time to actually absorb the shape of what had happened. I remember sitting on the floor of the house I'd inherited, still mostly unfurnished, going through box after box of leather-bound notebooks that spanned close to 50 years, watching a man's handwriting age across the decades, watching the entries shift from the sharp, angry cursive of a man in his 30s who'd just been betrayed to something slower and more deliberate in his later years, as though the anger had eventually settled into something closer to a discipline. Reading them, slowly, over several weeks, I found the entry about the business partner who betrayed him, written decades earlier, raw in a way as later, more controlled journal entries about the observation project, as he called it, never quite were. There were pages, in those early volumes, where he'd clearly written and then crossed out entire paragraphs, as though even he had found his own bitterness at the time too much to leave on the page. And buried in an entry from the year I turned 12, written only weeks after that first wallet incident, I found the sentence that I now understand was the true beginning of all of it. He'd written, simply, a boy returned a stranger's wallet today with more money in it than his own family likely sees in a month, and told the concession stand attendant he didn't want a reward. I want to know if that boy is real, or if he's a fluke, the way I once believed a business partner's decency was real. I intend to find out, patiently, for as long as it takes. Beneath that entry, in different ink, added years later, he'd written a single additional line I didn't find until my third pass through the journal. 17 now. Stayed for a friend. Still real. I don't fully know why I was the one he picked to start with. Out of however many small moments of decency happen in the world in any given year that nobody ever notices or tracks, I've come to believe, reading his journals, that it wasn't really about me specifically at all, not at first. It was about him needing, after being so completely wrong about one person, to find out whether he could still trust his own judgment about people in general. I happened to be the test case he started with. I simply never stopped being one for 20 years without ever knowing it. I inherited, in the end, a house I will probably never live in, a modest but real fortune I'm still working out how to think about responsibly, and a stack of journals from a man I never met who nonetheless knew more continuous, careful detail about my character than almost anyone who has ever actually loved me. I used a portion of it, in the first year, to quietly do the one thing I felt certain Arthur himself would have approved of, given everything I now understood about how he'd spent his life. I found, through Ms. Patterson's careful, discreet research, Toby, The friend whose blame I'd once accepted at 17 for a broken cabinet door that wasn't mine. Now a struggling single father 3 states away, working 2 jobs and falling slowly behind on a mortgage he'd taken on with more hope than security. I helped him, anonymously, the way I'd once been helped by a man I never met, with a real amount of cash and an unsigned note. I didn't tell him it was me. I didn't sign a name, the same way none had ever been signed to me. And standing at that mailbox, I understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself feel until that exact moment, the strange, patient loneliness Arthur must have carried for 30 years, watching from just outside a life he decided never to actually enter. I didn't do it to close some cosmic loop. I did it because it was, by that point, simply the shape my life had already been quietly bent into by a stranger's patient attention, whether I'd known it or not. It's raining tonight, the same kind of steady, unremarkable rain that was falling the Thursday. I drove 3 states over to hear a stranger explain 20 years of my own life back to me. I keep one of Arthur's journal pages framed on my desk now. Not the will, not the final note, but the very first entry, the one about the boy and the wallet, written by a man who had every reason in the world to believe people were simply not to be trusted, and who decided, instead, to spend 3 decades patiently checking. I think about the 11 of us sometimes, the 10 I'll likely never meet, whose ordinary mixed human choices Arthur watched with the same careful attention he gave mine, and who never got the phone call I got. Not because they were bad people, but because most people, turns out, are simply human in the specific, forgivable way Arthur wasn't quite able to forgive after what happened to him. I think, too, about the strange mercy underneath the harshness of his project. That even the 3 who fail were never publicly named, never confronted, never made to feel the weight of the test they didn't know they'd taken. Arthur simply, quietly, stopped watching and let them keep whatever peace came from never knowing. There's a kindness buried even in that. I've come to think, though it took me a long time to see it, as anything other than cold. I still get envelopes, in a way. Not from Arthur, obviously. But every March now, without fail, I sit down and write one myself, to someone I've noticed, quietly, doing the harder and more honest thing when nobody was checking. A cashier who chased down a customer over an accidental undercharge. A teenager at a gas station who returned a lost phone with the screen still lit up on someone else's messages. Unread. I don't sign them either. I've come to understand, in a way I never could have before that Thursday in the rain, exactly why Arthur never let himself get close enough to find out how his money landed. Some kindnesses only stay honest if you never get to see what they cost the person receiving them, or what they mean. If there's a single thing I've taken from all of this, it's not really about the money, and it's not really about Arthur Lowell. Whatever else I've come to understand about the particular grief that shaped his whole strange, quiet second half of a life. It's this. You will almost certainly never know, in the moment, which small, unglamorous choice to do the harder and more honest thing is the one someone, somewhere, is quietly keeping score of. Most of the time, probably, no one is watching at all. But every once in a while, for 20 years, someone is.